Most people imagine manipulation begins when someone makes a demand. It usually starts much earlier. Long before control, there is testing, quiet testing, small moments that seem too minor to question, a joke that goes too far, a favor that feels slightly presumptuous, a private detail shared too soon, a subtle contradiction to see whether you defend your own reality or surrender it for peace. This is where skilled manipulators do their real work. They do not begin by dominating you. They begin by reading you. They look for your threshold, your need to be liked, your fear of tension, your hunger for approval, your confusion about what counts as rude, unfair, or invasive. And once they know where your boundaries weaken, control becomes much easier. If you understand this sequence, a lot of confusing relationships start to make sense. Certain friendships, certain romances, certain bosses, certain coworkers. You realize the problem was not that the manipulation came out of nowhere. The problem was that you were watching for aggression while they were using calibration. In this episode, we're going to break that sequence down clearly, how manipulators test people before they control them, why intelligent people still miss the early signs, what these tests look like in dating, friendship, and professional life, and most importantly, how to respond in a way that protects you without turning every interaction into a war. The central idea is simple. Manipulators rarely start with force. They start with information. And the fastest way to gather that information is to test your boundaries in small, deniable ways. Once you see that, you stop asking, was that a big enough offense to matter? And you start asking a better question. What were they learning about me in that moment? That question changes everything. Because social life is full of testing. Not all of it is malicious. Some people test unconsciously, some test out of insecurity, some test because they have learned through experience that people reveal themselves more honestly under slight pressure than during polite conversation. Human beings are constantly checking one another for strength, flexibility, usefulness, emotional stability, and rank. In ordinary life, this can be harmless. A new friend lightly challenges your opinion to see whether you can disagree without becoming unstable. A colleague asks for a small favor to gauge whether you are cooperative. A romantic interest teases you to see whether you have emotional balance. Social life has always involved these tiny probes. But manipulation begins when this normal social calibration becomes strategic leverage. The goal is no longer simple understanding. The goal becomes access, asymmetry, and control. The manipulator wants to know three things. First, what can they get away with? Second, what makes you bend? Third, how much resistance will they face if they push further? This is why the first stage of manipulation often feels strangely ambiguous. It is designed that way. If they are too aggressive too early, they expose themselves. If they stay subtle, they can gather data while preserving deniability. If you object, they can say you are overreacting. If you comply, they have learned something valuable. That is the essence of the test. It is not always about the immediate gain. Often the gain is diagnostic. A manipulator may ask for a favor they do not even need, just to see whether guilt moves you. They may disrespect your time, not because the delay matters, but because your reaction tells them whether you can be inconvenienced without consequence. They may insult you lightly in public, not because the insult itself is important, but because your silence reveals whether social pressure can keep you passive. Seen this way, manipulation looks less like dramatic villainy and more like behavioral research. They run small experiments. You provide the data. And if your data tells them that you can be confused, rushed, flattered, isolated, or guilted into compliance, the next experiment becomes bolder. This is why people often say, after a toxic relationship or workplace experience, it got bad so slowly I did not notice. Of course it did. Escalation is easier when each step feels only slightly worse than the last. A person who would never accept open domination may still accept 100 minor distortions, each one framed as reasonable, accidental, affectionate, or temporary. This is one of the oldest truths in power. Direct conquest creates resistance. Gradual encroachment creates adaptation. Machiavelli understood this in politics. Nietzsche understood it in struggles of will. Modern behavioral psychology sees it in compliance patterns and boundary erosion. Human beings normalize what they repeatedly tolerate. What shocks you once can become familiar if introduced in increments. The manipulator depends on that adaptation. They do not need you to approve of what they are doing. They only need you to keep adjusting. So the first key point is this. Manipulators test small because small tests bypass the ego's alarm system. Most people think they would notice manipulation. They imagine they would react strongly if someone tried to control them. But that confidence is based on a fantasy of obvious threat. Real manipulation rarely announces itself clearly at the start. It arrives below your threshold for decisive action. A friend makes you the default emotional dumping ground, then disappears when you need support. A partner reads your messages over your shoulder and calls it curiosity. A boss gives vague instructions, then blames you for not reading between the lines. A charismatic person pushes a personal question, then says they just feel comfortable with you. None of these moments, in isolation, seems dramatic enough to justify a confrontation. That is why they work. Each test asks a quiet question. Will you name the problem? Will you minimize it? Will you rationalize it for them? Will you betray your own discomfort to preserve the atmosphere? Your answer teaches them how to continue. The dangerous part is that many good people are trained to fail these tests. They have been taught that kindness means accommodation, that maturity means staying unbothered, that confidence means never appearing sensitive, that empathy means interpreting other people generously, even when the pattern is repeatedly one-sided. So when the test comes, they often respond in ways that reward the tester. They laugh off disrespect. They explain away selfishness. They offer second, third, and fourth chances without any structural change. They believe being understanding will inspire reciprocity. Sometimes it does with healthy people. With manipulators, it usually creates opportunity. Because manipulators interpret tolerance differently. You think, I am being patient. They think, the boundary is weak. You think, I do not want to make this awkward. They think, social discomfort controls them. You think, maybe they did not mean it that way. They think, excellent. Plausible deniability works. This is why awareness matters so much. Not because every awkward interaction hides a predator, but because repeated ambiguity always benefits the more strategic person. If one person is interpreting charitably while the other is calibrating opportunistically, the game is already uneven. The second key point is that manipulators often test for insecurity before they test for obedience. This matters because control is rarely one size fits all. A skilled manipulator does not simply force, they tailor. They want to know what kind of pressure works on you specifically, and to discover that, they look for insecurity, not because insecurity makes you weak in some total sense. Many insecure people are intelligent, talented, and outwardly strong, but insecurity creates predictable points of entry. It creates areas where perception matters too much, where rejection feels too costly, where approval becomes disproportionately valuable. If someone senses that you are desperate to be seen as competent, they may use criticism and praise to keep you off balance. If they sense you fear abandonment, they may alternate warmth and distance. If they sense you pride yourself on being selfless, they may exploit guilt. If they sense you hate looking difficult, they may use public settings to trap you into compliance. This is why early manipulation often feels strangely personal. They seem to know exactly where to press. That is not always mystical insight. Often it is the result of testing. They watch what you over-explain. They watch what makes you defensive. They watch what compliments affect you too strongly. They watch where your tone changes, where your posture tightens, where your certainty disappears. Human beings leak information constantly, especially around the things they most want to hide. A manipulator pays attention to that leakage. Imagine a new coworker who lightly questions your competence in meetings, but always in a tone soft enough to seem harmless. If you respond with excessive justification every time, they learn that status anxiety lives there. Now they know they can destabilize you by making you feel evaluated. Imagine a romantic interest who becomes intensely attentive, then pulls back just enough to make you chase. If your energy suddenly spikes, if you become unusually eager to restore closeness, they learn that intermittent attention is powerful on you. Imagine a friend who borrows money, time, or emotional labor, then gives you a story about how hard things have been. If guilt immediately overrides your resentment, they learn that moral self-image can be used against you. This is not random, this is mapping. People often ask why manipulation can feel so custom-built, so psychologically precise, because in many cases it is, not always with evil genius sophistication. Sometimes the person is simply socially predatory in an intuitive way. They may not think in abstract terms, but they have learned through experience that certain behaviors reveal where people bend. They do not need a formal theory. Reinforcement taught them enough. When a certain tactic gets results, it stays. When resistance appears, they adapt. That brings us to the third key point. Most tests are designed to create asymmetry. Manipulation thrives when one person has more information, more emotional distance, more social cover, or more freedom to reinterpret events. So early tests often aim to build that asymmetry before any obvious control appears. One common way this happens is through premature intimacy. Someone tells you a deeply personal story very early. They say they feel unusually connected to you. They disclose trauma, betrayal, or private fears. On the surface, this can feel like trust. Sometimes it is. But in manipulative dynamics, the purpose is often different. They are accelerating emotional closeness before mutual reality has been established. Why? Because early intimacy changes the rules. Once you feel special, chosen, or trusted, you become more likely to excuse anomalies. You become invested in preserving the bond. You hesitate to judge them by ordinary standards because the connection already feels exceptional. And if you reciprocate by sharing your own vulnerabilities, the asymmetry deepens. Now they know more about your fears, needs, insecurities, and history than they otherwise would. Information is leverage. The same is true in work settings. A manager may position themselves as your protector, confidant, or sponsor, but do so in a way that keeps expectations unwritten and loyalty personal rather than professional. A colleague may pull you into gossip or private criticism of others, creating shared secrecy that later compromises your independence. Notice the pattern. The test is not just, will you open up? It is, how quickly can I move this relationship onto terrain that benefits me? Another form of asymmetry comes through inconsistent standards. They expect immediate replies from you but take hours or days themselves. They demand emotional transparency from you but become vague when questioned. They ask favors casually, then act burdened when you need anything. They make you explain yourself while they remain undefined. If you accept this imbalance early, they do not just gain convenience, they gain structure. A structure in which your behavior is monitored and theirs is discretionary. This is one of the clearest signs that you are being tested for future control, not merely disrespect, structural asymmetry. The fourth key point is that many tests rely on deniability. This is what makes them so hard to confront. The manipulator often chooses behaviors that can be interpreted in more than one way. The act itself is minor enough to dismiss, but meaningful enough to reveal your response. A backhanded compliment, a boundary crossed in a playful tone, a request made with just enough urgency to trigger guilt, a private jab disguised as honesty, an obvious slight followed by, "I was only joking." Deniability is powerful because it puts the burden on you, not just to notice the problem but to prove intent. And proving intent in human relationships is often impossible. So many people get trapped in the wrong standard of evidence. They think they need certainty before they respond. They wait for a confession, a dramatic incident, an undeniable pattern that even a third party would instantly validate. By then, the damage is usually advanced. The better standard is not, can I prove they meant harm? The better standard is, what effect does this pattern have? And what does my response teach them? This is a more realistic way to think, especially in social strategy. You do not need a courtroom-level case to protect your boundaries. You do not need to solve the mystery of someone's soul before deciding how accessible you will be. Intent matters morally. Pattern matters strategically. If someone repeatedly puts you in positions where you feel confused, indebted, diminished, or pressured, the practical question is not whether they are secretly evil. The practical question is whether continued access serves you. Many people stay vulnerable because they are trying to achieve perfect interpretation, but social self-protection often requires something simpler: pattern recognition. If a person repeatedly benefits from ambiguity, treat ambiguity itself as information. If every overstep comes wrapped in humor, vagueness, affection, or crisis, that wrapping is not separate from the behavior. It is part of the behavior. It is the delivery system. This is especially important for conscientious people, because conscientious people often give manipulators too much interpretive charity. They are reluctant to assign bad motives. They fear becoming cynical. They fear unfairness, so they stay stuck in internal debate while the manipulator keeps gathering ground. A sharper approach is this: respond to what happened, not to the story attached to it. If someone disrespects your time, address the behavior. If someone pushes a boundary, name the boundary. If someone creates repeated confusion, reduce exposure. You do not have to accuse them of sinister intent. In fact, you often gain more power by staying behavior-focused and emotionally clean. That leads directly to the fifth key point. The way you respond to small tests determines whether larger tests arrive. This is where many people make a costly mistake. They think the only alternatives are passivity or explosion. Either say nothing and stay polite, or finally erupt after months of accumulated resentment. Both options usually help the manipulator. Passivity invites escalation. Explosion makes you look unstable and lets them reframe you as the problem. The strongest response is often neither submissive nor dramatic. It is calm friction, a small, clear signal that the line was noticed and that access will not be effortless. This can take different forms. A pause instead of nervous laughter, a simple correction instead of a long emotional speech, a refusal without apology, a question that makes the behavior visible, a delay in availability, a decision not to over-explain. These responses matter because manipulators are constantly measuring cost. If boundary crossing produces easy rewards, they continue. If it creates clean resistance with low emotional payoff, many will redirect toward easier targets. This is one of the least glamorous truths about influence. A great deal of social predation survives not because it is invincible, but because it is efficient. It seeks low-resistance paths. If you become a high-friction path, the dynamic often changes. Consider a simple example in dating. Someone repeatedly makes cutting jokes at your expense, then smiles as if you are expected to take it well. A weak response is forced laughter while you privately feel diminished. Another weak response is a furious confrontation 3 weeks later about everything. A stronger response is immediate and light but firm. I do not do disrespect disguised as humor. Then silence. Then observe. Do they recalibrate, deflect, mock, or escalate? The response is not just boundary setting. It is diagnosis. In friendship, maybe someone only reaches out when they need help, but becomes hard to find when you need anything. Instead of a dramatic accusation, you stop making premium access automatic. You become cordial but less available. You watch whether the relationship has any substance without your over-functioning. In professional life, maybe a coworker keeps trying to push last-minute work onto you with social pressure. Instead of offering a long defensive explanation, you say, "I cannot take that on today." No guilt performance, no elaborate justification. Just an answer. People who rely on your discomfort often lose momentum when your discomfort is no longer available for them to use. This is crucial. Your first goal is not to win an argument. Your first goal is to interrupt the data they are collecting. If every probe tells them you can be guilted, rushed, flattered, or confused, the system rights itself. If a probe instead tells them you notice patterns, tolerate tension, and do not collapse under mild social pressure, their strategy becomes less profitable. The sixth key point is that people miss manipulation tests because they confuse niceness with safety. This confusion is everywhere. A person seems charming, articulate, emotionally expressive, socially skilled, even generous, so others assume they are safe. But niceness and safety are not the same thing. Warmth can be sincere, it can also be instrumental. Many manipulative people understand that overt aggression is inefficient early on. They present as unusually attentive, validating, humorous, or emotionally perceptive. This creates trust faster than blunt force ever could. It also makes later boundary violations harder to process, because they clash with the image already established in your mind. You start defending the image against the evidence. You think, but they were so kind. Yes, and that may have been real in part. Human beings are rarely pure caricatures. A manipulative person can be charming, wounded, intelligent, and genuinely generous in selective moments. That complexity is exactly why people get trapped. They keep waiting for the good version to be the real one and the troubling behavior to be the exception. But in strategy, the pattern matters more than the persona. A person is not safe because they seem emotionally warm. They are safe if they can tolerate your boundaries without punishing you for them. They are safe if your no does not trigger guilt campaigns, cold withdrawal, ridicule, or retaliation. They are safe if they do not need confusion to maintain influence. That is a far better test than charisma. Ask yourself this: what happens when access is limited? What happens when you disagree? What happens when you do not perform the role they prefer? That is where safety becomes visible. This applies to romantic chemistry as well. Intensity is often mistaken for depth. Fast connection is mistaken for compatibility. Being deeply seen is mistaken for being deeply respected. But a manipulator may study you closely without respecting you. In fact, some of the most destabilizing people are excellent readers of emotion. They can mirror, affirm, and attune with great skill. The issue is not whether they understand you. The issue is what they do with that understanding. Do they use insight to build trust or to engineer dependence? That is the dividing line. And now we arrive at the seventh key point. Your real protection is not becoming cold. It is becoming legible to yourself. Many people respond to painful experiences by trying to become impossible to read. They want stronger armor, less emotion, more distance, more suspicion. Sometimes some of that is useful in the short term, but permanent emotional opacity is not the highest form of protection. It can isolate you from healthy connection and make life feel like endless defense. A more durable protection is self-clarity. The clearer you are about your values, boundaries, insecurities, relational patterns, and pressure points, the harder you are to manipulate through them. Not because no one will ever test you, but because the test will yield less useful confusion. If you know you have a strong need to be liked, you can catch the moment when social approval starts distorting your judgment. If you know you fear abandonment, you can recognize when intermittent attention is hijacking your nervous system. If you know you over-identify with being helpful, you can notice when guilt is pulling you into unequal exchanges. In other words, the manipulator's advantage shrinks when your blind spots shrink. This is one reason philosophical realism matters. It trains you to see human interaction without fantasy, not with paranoia, but without illusion. It asks you to accept that social life includes strategy, appetite, ego, rivalry, vanity, dependency, performance, and hidden incentives. Once you accept that, you stop needing every relationship to look pure in order to feel secure. You become calmer, less idealistic in the naive sense, more precise, and precision is protective. A person who knows themselves clearly does not need to moralize every interaction. They do not need to label everyone toxic. They simply read the pattern, adjust access, and move accordingly. This is more powerful than outrage. Outrage is loud, but often reactive. Clarity is quieter and far more strategic. So what should you actually watch for in real life? Watch for the person who gives with one hand and measures with the other. Watch for the person who moves too fast into intimacy, obligation, or dependency. Watch for the person who keeps creating ambiguity that somehow always benefits them. Watch for minor disrespect that arrives wrapped in charm. Watch for requests that feel designed to see whether your guilt outruns your judgment. Watch for people who seem fascinated by your vulnerabilities before they have earned your trust. Watch for how they behave when you become less easy to manage. That last one reveals almost everything, because the early test is never just about the moment, it is about the future. When someone interrupts you repeatedly, they may be learning whether your voice is easy to erase, When someone lightly mocks your standards, they may be learning whether shame can detach you from your own boundaries. When someone pushes for fast closeness, they may be learning whether emotional acceleration can override discernment. When someone creates small obligations, they may be building the psychology of indebtedness one brick at a time. And if you keep misreading these moments as isolated incidents, you will miss the architecture forming around you. That is how control becomes normal, not through one dramatic act, but through a sequence of tolerated tests. This is why the right response to manipulation is rarely panic. It is observation with memory. Do not look at each moment alone. Link the pattern. Notice what they do, what follows, what role you are being trained into, and what happens when you resist that role. Social intelligence is not just reading other people's emotions. It is recognizing the structure of repeated interactions. Ask yourself a few hard questions. After spending time with this person, do I feel clearer or more confused? Do I feel respected or subtly managed? Are my boundaries easier to hold around them or harder? Do I find myself explaining obvious things too often? Am I reacting to reality or to the image I want them to be? Does the relationship become healthier when I become less compliant, or does it become punitive? These questions matter because manipulation often survives by exhausting your ability to interpret. It keeps you mentally busy with exceptions, excuses, and emotional static. The result is that you lose contact with the simplest data of all, how the relationship actually functions. And that simplicity is where your power returns. If the pattern is exploitative, you do not need a philosophical masterpiece to justify protecting yourself. You need proportion. You need boundaries that are observable in behavior, not just noble ideas in your head. You need the willingness to let people be disappointed, confused, or offended by your limits without rushing to repair their perception. That is where many adults still struggle. They can detect the manipulation intellectually, but they still cannot tolerate the social discomfort of resisting it. They know the person is testing them, but they hate the feeling of seeming cold, difficult, suspicious, or ungrateful. Manipulators depend on that hesitation. They know many people would rather endure quiet resentment than risk open tension. So learn this well. Discomfort is not always danger. Sometimes discomfort is simply the sensation of a boundary becoming real. If a calm no changes the entire emotional weather of the relationship, that tells you something important. Not necessarily that the person is monstrous, but that your compliance was playing a larger role than you realized. The mask slips when friction appears, and that information is expensive only if you ignore it. Healthy people may not love every boundary, but they can metabolize it. They adjust, they ask, they clarify. They do not need to punish you for self-respect. Manipulative people often cannot tolerate this because boundaries interrupt the asymmetric structure they were building. So they may try a final set of tactics, they may guilt you, they may withdraw affection, they may frame you as selfish, they may act wounded, confused, or disappointed, they may recruit others subtly, they may suddenly become exceptionally charming again. Do not be hypnotized by the changing costume. The strategy is still the strategy. When access stops being effortless, they switch methods. That is why one of the strongest forms of social maturity is consistency. Not aggression, not coldness. Consistency. The ability to respond from principle rather than from the manipulator's latest emotional weather pattern. If your standards disappear the moment someone becomes upset, flattering, tragic, or intense, then your standards are not yet real. They are moods. Real boundaries survive performance. And that is the deeper lesson here. Manipulators test you before they control you because control is easier when the target collaborates unconsciously. The goal is to train your responses before you even realize a game is being played. To make you self-censor, overgive, over-explain, doubt yourself, and normalize asymmetry until resistance feels impolite. But once you understand the tests, the spell weakens. You stop thinking every problem must begin with obvious malice. You stop demanding certainty before self-protection. You stop confusing someone's charm with their character. You stop treating your own discomfort as irrelevant evidence. And perhaps most importantly, you stop negotiating against yourself just to maintain social smoothness. That does not mean becoming hard, cynical, or merciless. It means becoming difficult to quietly reorganize. There is a difference. The most dangerous manipulators are not always the loudest or cruelest. Often, they are the ones who seem reasonable while slowly redrawing the terms of the relationship in their favor. One joke at a time, one favor at a time, one guilt trip at a time, one blurred line at a time, until your role is fixed and your resistance feels abnormal. By then, many people do not feel controlled. They feel tired, they feel confused, they feel responsible for fixing a dynamic they did not create. That exhaustion is not accidental. It is one of the outcomes of prolonged testing and subtle boundary erosion. A confused person is easier to guide. A guilty person is easier to use. A person who doubts their own perceptions is easier to define from the outside. That is why your task is not to become perfect at reading every hidden motive. Your task is to become reliable in what you do when patterns emerge. Notice, name, adjust, observe again. That rhythm is enough to protect you from most low-grade manipulation long before it matures into something more serious. So return to the question we started with. Not, Was that offense big enough to matter? But what were they learning about me in that moment? Were they learning that you abandon your standards under charm? That guilt can purchase your time? That ambiguity makes you freeze? That public pressure makes you comply? That attention makes you overlook asymmetry? Or were they learning something else that you notice? That you can remain calm inside tension? That access to you is shaped by mutual respect? That your empathy does not cancel your discernment? That your kindness is real, but not available for exploitation? Those are very different lessons, and people respond to them very differently. In the end, this is not just about avoiding manipulators. It is about understanding human nature without illusions. Social life is full of subtle negotiations over access, influence, status, and emotional control. Some of this is benign. Some of it is deeply predatory. Wisdom lies in telling the difference early, before confusion hardens into structure. Because once a person learns they can train you through small tests, they rarely stop on their own. The cleanest defense is to make sure the lesson they learn is this: you are observant, you are composed, and you do not surrender your judgment just because the game is quiet. If this sharpened the way you read people, subscribe for more episodes on power, psychology, and social strategy. And if you have ever seen one of these tests in real life, you already know how much can hide inside something small.